Welcome, everybody, to Irish Illustrated's first edition of Irish Illustrated ISO. I'm Tim Priester of Irish Illustrated, and we're going to give this a shot. Tim O'Malley and I will be doing these periodically. We're adding this to our podcast menu where we are going solo, and I'm starting out today. And the topic is not only Chris Ash, Notre Dame's what we expect to be Notre Dame's next defensive coordinator, but just the evolution of the Notre Dame defensive coordinator position and defense in general since the firing of Brian Van Gorder during the 2016 season. And since then, it's been an 8-year defensive renaissance of Notre Dame football on the defensive side of the ball. The high water mark coming in 2012. Prior to that, with Bob Diaco, when Notre Dame played for the national title, of course, against Alabama, and Notre Dame's defense finished number 2 in the nation at 12.77 points per game under Bob Diaco. They were also 7th in total defense and 11th in rushing defense. And after he left the following year to start his head coaching career, in came Brian Van Gorder. And as we all know, that did not go very well. They immediately slipped to number 82 in the country in scoring defense in 2014. And then after a bad start in 2016, particularly at Texas, where I called for his firing. I've never done anything like that in print before, but it seemed appropriate. And a few games later, that's exactly what they did. They fired him. They brought in Greg Hudson, a former Notre Dame linebacker himself, who had some defensive coordinator roles in the past, one of them being at Florida State. Mike Elston helped him through, and they really were able to patch it together pretty well the rest of the season. But obviously, they needed a dynamic defensive coordinator. And ironically, I wasn't tipped to this, but as I was looking at potential candidates for 2017, a guy that I ran across was Mike Elko, who was at Wake Forest. I thought the defensive coordinator at Wake Forest would be a good Notre Dame fit, and he had done really, really good things. And lo and behold, that's who Notre Dame pegged. I was not tipped off about that. So I kind of got lucky on that one. And in his first year, his first and only year, which was very frustrating and disappointing at the time, when Texas A&M outbid Notre Dame on multiple occasions in order to land him. But in his first year, there was definite improvement. Notre Dame was number 31 in the country in scoring defense at 21.5 points per game. He had shaved off a touchdown per game. And so that was the foundation. They still weren't a great defense, but they were vastly improved. They were a much better tackling team. He emphasized ball disruptions. And I had a really neat experience with him at the coaches convention in the spring. I went to that, and I went to everything that all of his presentations may have only been one or two, but I thought it was pretty fascinating because when it came to ball disruptions, he had a clinic where he taught the various ways to cause a fumble. I had never given that any consideration, but if you think about it, um, at one time a defender is tackling a guy with the football in front of him. The next time he's tackling him with the football to the side of him, and sometimes you're trying to tackle him, while chasing him from behind. And there were different ways that Mike Elko taught his defensive players to force a fumble, which I thought was a really innovative and fascinating thing. So he set the foundation. And I know Notre Dame took a chance by hiring Clark Lee in 2018, but it was absolutely a really good call. Recommended or certainly approved by Jack Swarbrick when he was asked his 2 cents about Clark Lee and what Notre Dame thought of him as a coach. Clark Lee's one of the great individuals in the game of football. That's why when people said he was not a very good recruiter, I don't want him to be the defensive coordinator or even a head coach. And I realize he's a head coach in his alma mater, but Clark Lee's one of the great individuals in the game. And whether he has a ton of personality to recruit or not, that's not the point. But he did a great job. 18.2 points per game, 13th in the country, 17.9 points, 12th in the country. And then his third year, 19.7 points, 14th in the country. And then Notre Dame went out and landed the name that pretty much anyone in the country would have wanted, Marcus Freeman, to be the defensive coordinator. Of course, he was only coordinator for 1 year in 2021. But ironically, and I thought about this looking back at it, since the renaissance of Notre Dame defense, Mike Elko, Clark Lee, Marcus Freeman, and then Al Golden, you could argue that Freeman had the worst of all of those years. Now they only gave up 19.1 points per game because that was 15th in the country, but they also were 43rd in total defense. They were 64th in pass defense. Remember, they ran some zone blitzes where they dropped defensive ends into coverage, and that used to look a little bit clunky when he did it. But Marcus Freeman obviously took the head coaching job next, and then they tabbed Al Golden. There, John Haycock was a guy that Notre Dame had looked at, but it was Al Golden. And after a little bit of a rough start, which is normal when a defensive coordinator comes in, and if it is ultimately Chris Ash, which we think it will be, there is going to be an adjustment period, especially when you lose leaders like Jack Kaiser, your two interior defensive linemen, Xavier Watts. There's some good Benjamin Morrison. There's some good players that are gone from this. But Golden came in and did a tremendous job. And, he hit his philosophy, of course, was he was more concerned about defending the pass than being a shutdown run defense. They were still pretty good to very good as a run defense, but it was more about the pass, the modern day game. I mean, the game changed. But what was once called a base defense really became the majority of the time nickel defense under Al Golden, because that was just the change of the way the game was changing. They were tremendous in the red zone this past year. The numbers don't necessarily reflect it because they had a poor game as far as touchdown percentage in the red zone. They had a very poor game against USC, and that really slanted how Notre Dame did in the red zone under Golden this year. But number one pass efficiency rating, number 5 in interceptions, number 6 in yards per pass attempt, which I think is a very, very key number. And so that takes us up to where we are today, waiting to hear from Notre Dame whether Chris Ash is actually the successor to Al Golden. One of the great things that Al Golden did, Tim O'Malley mentioned this in our last edition of Irish Illustrated Insider, was his ability to adjust on the fly. It was as good, I think, as we've ever seen a defensive coordinator adjust on the fly. Al Golden said you can't wait till halftime to make adjustments, and he wouldn't. There were times where it took one drive before things settled in. Before the great Notre Dame defense stepped forward under Al Golden, and it did. So as far as successors, Jim Leonhard was a guy that I think everybody wanted. I think Jim Leonhard was a name that among Notre Dame fans would have almost been universally accepted. And that was why Notre Dame pursued him this time. They pursued him a little bit the previous time before Al Golden was hired. Jim Leonhard just did a tremendous job at Wisconsin from 2017 to 2022. Wisconsin finished number 3, 34, 10, 9, 4, and 17 in scoring defense. They were great against the run, number 1 in the country in 2021, number 1 in total defense in 2021. But alas, no Jim Leonhard. It's the second time now that he's turned Notre Dame down, and it looks like he wants to stay in the NFL. Would love to have him. A guy for me that was comparable to Mike Elko in 2017 is Joe Rossi, who did really a sensational job at Minnesota. And, like you can't always strictly adhere to the numbers for a coordinator at a lesser school because, it's difficult for Minnesota to be in the top 20 in defense every year. And he started out number 36 in scoring defense, dipped down to 69th in 2020, and then they were sixth in the country and 4th in the country in the next 2 years in scoring defense. He's now at Michigan State. A typical struggle in the first year of him adapting at Michigan State, but he's a really, really, really good defensive coordinator. I would have been personally would have been happy if Notre Dame had landed certainly Jim Leonhard, but even Joe Rossi. So as it relates to Chris Ash, I don't believe in saying that you can just discount what happened to him when he was a head coach. He was head coach at Rutgers from 2016 to 2019. And I don't think using the word disaster would be an exaggeration. It was a disaster. They were 8-32. They were shut out in 20% of the games that he was head coach. He was fired after 4 games into his 3rd season. And I just don't think that you can say, well, he was a head coach and Notre Dame's hiring him as a defensive coordinator. That doesn't mean anything. Excuse me. It doesn't mean as much because it's a different role. And the same argument that we have for Mike Mickens being a DB coach, and we'll talk about Mickens in this segment as well. Uh, you can't just say, hey, it was a head coach. It's not applicable. He was in a leadership role, and they were getting hammered. They were beaten 78-0 by Michigan. And here's the thing: he followed Kyle Flood. Kyle Flood was 8-5 in 2014. 2 years later, along came Chris Ash, and it wasn't productive at all. Eight wins in 3 years and a handful of games. I'm not sure if I said that correctly before. It was 3 years and then a handful of games in year four. And Rutgers had gone to a bowl game 5 of the previous 6 years. So my point being that he was in a leadership role, and you can't completely discount that. And yet, yeah, because Kyle Flood went 27-24. Greg Schiano before him, his first tour of duty at Rutgers was he won 11 games 1 year, he won 9 games twice, he won 8 games twice. So anyway, but that is not the role that Chris Ash will have to play. He was defensive coordinator at Arkansas for 1 year, and this is another caveat I think that it's important to insert there. When you can't judge a new defensive coordinator just based on his first year, you have to look at what he inherited. And what he inherited at Arkansas was not good. It was not good at all. He gave up 30, or his defense gave up 30.8 points per game in his 1 year at Arkansas. But he inherited a defense that gave up something similar. They improved in some areas and not other ones. And remember, that was Brett Bielema's first year at Arkansas as head coach in 2013. I'm sorry, it was his first year at Arkansas in 2013. So it was a transition. So why did Chris Ash not stay at Arkansas? Well, because Urban Meyer came calling at Ohio State, and he went to Ohio State and was there from 2014 through 2015. He shared the coordinator's role with Luke Fickell. Luke Fickell was the play caller. He was the lead man. And Ash was the true co-coordinator. He was coaching the secondary. They had 24 interceptions in his first year. It was his first year. They also had 45 sacks. And then in the second year, they allowed 15.1 points per game. And it was a great defense. And he played a significant role in that. I've written this and I used this in a previous podcast, but I think it's worth repeating. Whether you dislike or don't respect Urban Meyer for who he is or what he's done, what he did to Notre Dame, not coming to Notre Dame as a head coach, I get all that, but you still have to count what he says. And this is what he said about Chris Ash. The top coordinator hire to me in all of college football was Chris Ash. He called him one of the best coaches he's ever been around. And of course, he was the co-coordinator of the national title. The Urban Meyer won in 2014. And Tom Herman, like why was Chris Ash so transient during these years? Well, he came in with Tom Herman in Tom Herman's last year at Texas when Herman was fired. So he wasn't retained by the new staff after that. And I think that stuff's all perfectly normal. The 1 year that he was at Texas, and the reason that Tom Herman was fired was because they were very bad on defense, and Chris Ash was not able to turn that around in 1 year. And again, I'm not giving him a free pass because, Mike Elko came in and inherited a disaster and put Notre Dame in 31st in the country in scoring defense. So it can be done. Ash didn't do that in these situations, but I think it's very important that you understand that he walked into a bad situation at Texas, and Tom Herman was fired after that. And so he became, after 2 years at Ohio State, that's when Ash became the head coach at Rutgers from 2016 to 2019. Then came the Texas experience, and he went on to coach in the NFL, which I think is valuable. I'll talk about that in a moment, but one of the things that was said about Al Golden when he came to Notre Dame was that he hadn't been a defensive coordinator in years. And that's worth noting. I get that, but it's not like the guys are out they're out of the game. They're still fully immersed in the game as coaches. And so Ash hasn't been a coordinator since 2020. It had been 17 years since Al Golden had been a coordinator, and that did not stop him from having an exceptional tenure at Notre Dame. And remember, now um, Leonard appears to have been Marcus Freeman's first choice again, but Chris Ash absolutely was his second choice, and I think he was very adamant about getting Chris Ash. And so the process has been a little bit slow. I know Notre Dame fans are waiting for, okay, when's the announcement? Has it become official? It'll be official when it's official. And I would imagine that would be happening in pretty short order. I've also heard people say, this is just like Marcus Freeman settling on Jared Parker. I don't think it's the same thing at all. I think when things fell through with Andy Ludwig, and that was a botched performance by Notre Dame in losing Andy Ludwig, who, by the way, has since been fired at Utah. So it's amazing how one's profile changes from month to month, year to year. But it's not the same. I mean, I think that Jared Parker didn't have nearly the background in offense, in college offensive coordinating, as Ash has had on the defensive side of the ball. So I wouldn't make that direct comparison because I think it's very different. I do intend to, just as an aside, I do intend to attempt to get a hold of Urban Meyer and talk to him a little bit more extensively about Chris Ash and get some insight. But his comment about him, I've used that a couple times now. And Tom Herman, when he hired him at Texas, said he's as good a defensive mind as I've ever been around. People have asked about, well, how is he going to be as a recruiter? There's been mixed comments about that, but I quote the Rutgers AD when he hired him, which I think is worth repeating, and that was Pat Hobbs. Now, Pat Hobbs, I assume he was still the athletic director when he fired. I'm not sure if he was still the athletic director, but anyway, the comment was, in 25 years in higher education, Chris Ash is the single best interview I've had with any individual. That's quite a statement. And so that gives you a little bit of an idea of how he will be able to communicate on the recruiting trail. So again, we take bits and pieces and we make judgments. Like, do I know that whether Chris Ash is going to be a success or not? I don't know. I can provide the pros and the cons, and I read all these other people that know for certain whether he's going to be good or bad. I don't know how we exactly come to those conclusions, but we take all the information that we have. And I realize that because he's hasn't been a coordinator, it's another somewhat unusual choice, which Al Golden was at the time. And I don't believe in saying, well, Al Golden worked out, so Chris Ash is going to work out. It's two different people, two different situations. But we at Irish Illustrated will remain open-minded and see how it goes, and we'll evaluate along with everybody else as his tenure begins. Now, I think people were more interested in Mike Mickens being retained than they were Chris Ash actually being hired as the defensive coordinator. It appears that Mike Mickens will be a co-defensive coordinator, and I really think, I think this is a great opportunity for Mike Mickens because he will be teamed up with Ash, who has experience coordinating as a defensive backs coach. So I think it's a really good opportunity for Ash to share his experiences, having been a guy on the back end of the defense and then becoming a coordinator. And I've always said, I mean, all things being equal, I think a more ideal situation is for the guy that is trained as a linebackers coach to be the coordinator. And here's why I say that, because when you're the linebackers coach, you're part of the front seven. And when you're the linebackers coach, you're part of the back seven. So you have experience coaching an area that has to be a part of the front of the defense and the back of the defense when you're dropping back into pass coverage. So I've always kind of felt like that was the most ideal situation. And when I've questioned on a couple of occasions whether Mike Mickens is ready to be the DB coach, It's mainly because of that, and of course because of his inexperience calling plays. Being a DB's coach and being a coordinator are two completely different things. I think a linebackers coach has a better feel for it because he's had experience being the front part of the defense and the back part of the defense. I think I mentioned earlier, you have to be a bit prepared for a transition, especially with the key players, the leaders of that defense that were lost. You got a lot of good players still. You got a great young linebacking core. There looks like there's still some really good things happening at the defensive end position. The cornerbacks are intact. I know that bigger, longer cornerbacks are what Ash prefers, and that's what Notre Dame has been recruiting in recent years, and they have two good ones. I Notre Dame struggled a little bit on the back end of the defense with Christian Gray at the end of the national championship game. But Christian Gray, all things considered, had a really, really good year, and Leonard Moore had a sensational year as a freshman. But as it relates to Ash, creating turnovers, takeaways is a big part of it. I guess probably every coordinator says that, but he's lived it. They will pressure the quarterback. I'm interested to see exactly how he brings pressures because Al Golden mainly did it with the linebacker core. I'll be interested to see, especially since Ash has coached the DBs, whether he's a little bit more secondary blitz inclined than Golden was. I've read some stuff. I've seen some stuff about him defending, if not option football, read option football, and he's very precise in terms of responsibilities of each piece in that puzzle, which again is a common theme for most coordinators. But I think you're going to see him really emphasize players being 1/11th of the defense and taking care of your responsibility. That's pretty universal, but that's something that he has definitely preached. And something that John Bryce mentioned in our Irish Illustrated Insider podcast on Thursday, he does not have a ton of experience as a play caller. There's no doubt about that. Luke Fickell was the lead man when they were teamed up at Ohio State. So he doesn't have a ton of experience, and there will be a transition period. So just trying to keep this balanced and fair, and what are the positives and what are the negatives. I know that we're going to try to be open-minded about this, view it positively when there are positives and negatively when there are negatives. One thing I will say as of right now, and it looks like Joe Rudolph will remain at Notre Dame as an offensive line coach, considering Notre Dame just made a national title run. I mean, unless something changes from the moment that I'm saying this, I hope I don't speak it into existence, but Notre Dame has only lost one of the 10 assistant coaches, in a national title run year. So I think that's a really positive. It keeps a lot of continuity, but there is going to be a change at the defensive coordinator position. And it appears that it's going to be Chris Ash, 51-year-old Chris Ash from Iowa with a varied background. I like his background in the NFL. Pete Sampson mentioned the other day about the Notre Dame offensive lineman talking about dealing with Al Golden's defense and some of the stuff that he brought from the NFL game. I think Chris Ash is going to be in a position to do that. So let's try to be open-minded about this, judge everything on face value, and we appreciate you joining us today for the first edition of Irish Illustrated ISO.